There we go.
Hey everyone who's joining us. Let's wait a minute more for people to join. Take a couple of seconds, share with a friend, tell them they gotta be here.
This is always the awkward moment between those that join live and then those people that end up watching it later.
That's why you can fast forward a little bit if you're watching it later.
There we go. All right, well, I will kick us off. So welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kat Hampson, and I'm a pastor at Highrock Quincy, and soon to be pastor at Highrock Brookline.
And my name is Pastor Richard Lee, and I'm part of the Revelation 7 faculty for Highrock. You may have seen me preach one or two times. And for Pastor Kat and I, we're thrilled tonight to really return after last week to be your moderators for today's conversation tonight. We think it's expanding the conversation in a way. Thank you so much for being here or for watching this later. But to everyone who's on this online conversation and everybody who's joining and watching, we're really honored that we could help moderate this conversation for all of us today. But before we begin, we want to just take a little bit of time of carving this space out for what we hope this conversation will be, as well as sort of name what this conversation will be and what it will not be, given that our limited time together and just the sheer breadth of the stories of our brothers and sisters here. It's also important for us to really name how tonight's conversation is a follow-up to last week's panel discussion. If you are really having a lot of time on Facebook, you can go back and you can watch that before you watch this. But we really just are looking to continue that conversation. As Pastor Dave mentioned in his email, the goal of last Tuesday's event was to highlight the connectedness, all the different forms of racism in the United States, and to show that the learning that we've been learning about racism towards Black Americans has direct applications to us as we experience it as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Even though the ways that each of our communities have experienced that are distinct and different, and it's personally painful. Last Tuesday's conversation, however, also highlighted how challenging it is for us, for AAPIs, to sometimes find spaces to share and to process the racism that we've experienced for a variety of reasons. And so this tonight is really a space for that. A number of your Asian American brothers and sisters here at Highrock have agreed to share their stories and reflections and learnings and their engagement on not only their AAPI identity and experience, but also their understanding of how to engage this space. Mm-hmm. And so what we're really looking for is like a family room, living room discussion. And so we hope for all of you that you'll be engaged and alive with us on the Facebook chat as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so our hope is that this Facebook Live panel, as well as the comments, would model both a safe space and a brave space for our AAPI siblings to speak their stories, process their journeys. And so to that end, we want to invite everyone, Asian and non-Asian, to listen in and lean in, but we're also intentionally holding space to center AAPI voices, both in the panel and in the comment sections. So to that end, I offer some guiding principles for our time together online. If you identify as Asian American, Pacific Islander, Asian, we are so glad that you're here. And we invite you to take up space. take up space and speak up in the comments with written affirmations or encouragements, or, resonate with the stories that are spoken. Say like, yes, or that happened to me too. Or even offer differing lenses out of your own experiences. Definitely use emojis, definitely use reactions. And if you are AAPI, feel free to introduce yourself by name in the comments. Name your, share your name, share your Highrock campus if applicable, and do it right now. We'd love to know who's there in the family room. If you are non-Asian, we are glad you're here. We really are. And we encourage you to lean in and listen. But as much as possible, if you want to respond to what your Asian American Pacific Islander siblings are saying, we invite you to use non-verbal responses. So, Facebook Live reactions, Facebook Live emojis, click like, do all that. But if you're here and you're listening in as a non-Asian, feel free to center AAPI stories in this time and just type in, I'm listening, or I'm here for you, or something like that during this time.
Yeah, we're really trying to create a safe space for the Asian American voice, and so we're trying to figure this out in this virtual world, and so we'd love for you to just stay as engaged. So, like as Kat mentioned, if in the comments you hear a story and that happened to you, say so, right? You can talk about how that happened to me in 7th grade or whatever it may be. But whether anyone who is here and who's listening, Asian or non-Asian, you're welcome to pose questions to the panelists in the comments. But for the, how Facebook works, it's sometimes hard for us to be able to pull out exactly what the questions are. So we'd love for you to just label it with like an all caps question, and then write the question so that the moderator, will be able to make it very clear that this is a question for the panelists, and then we'll be able to get that to our panelists to answer.
Mm-hmm. A couple more acknowledgments before we begin introducing everybody. First, I know that we're gathered in a virtual space, but our Highrock churches and campuses, they do sit on the ancestral territories of Native Wampanoag, Pawtucket, Massachusetts, and Nipmuc peoples. And so Asian Americans have a really complicated relationship with whether we feel like we belong to this land or not. But we often forget that Indigenous peoples are the original stewards of the land. So while we don't have time to unpack that, we want to remember it. The second acknowledgement is that the majority of our panel here are of East Asian descent. And as Pastor Richard mentioned last week, the Asian American experience is not a monolith. And while there are common threads of like heritage and migration and acculturation and racialization and all that stuff, there's broad diversity there. And so while we talk about anti-Asian racism, which at this moment is really highlighting experiences of East Asians, let's not forget Islamophobia and discrimination against Arab and South Asian siblings as well. Mm-hmm. The third, last acknowledgement is that, as we as Asian Americans encourage each other to speak up, we also need to remember that it takes courage to do that, and it feels costly. And so as all of us are on this journey, whether we're waking up to racism for the first time or wondering who really understands us, or wondering how do I lean into solidarity with all of who I am, we welcome everyone at all places of that journey. And we thank you for bravely sharing and speaking up and using your voices and and sharing your presence with us this evening. So thank you. With that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves with their name, their Highrock campus, and naming their ethnic heritage. And as we do so, if you're joining us as Asian American, again, please feel free to introduce yourself in the comments section as well. So Justin, you're above me, so you go first.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Justin, and I am from Highrock, Arlington, and I'm an immigrant from South Korea.
Esther?
Hi, everyone. My name is Esther. I attend Highrock Cambridge, And I identify as a second generation Korean American. So that means that my parents were the ones who immigrated from Korea to the US, and then I was born and raised here. So. Mhm.
How about you, Greg?
Hi, folks. I'm Greg Shu. I attend Highrock Cambridge as well. And my parents are from Hong Kong and immigrated here by way of the United Kingdom. I was born in Pittsburgh and have been raised in the States. And I'm Hong Kong Cantonese Chinese American. Yeah.
Susan.
Hi, guys. My name is Susan Park. And just as an extra trick for those of you who know, my last name is Park, which means it sounds like I'm Korean, but in fact, I was born in Taiwan. I immigrated to the US when I was 5 and grew up in Chicago in the Midwest. And I attend Highrock Arlington.
My name is Richard Lee. I am part of the Revelation 7 faculty. I'm Korean American. I was born many years ago. My parents, actually, as Korean American parents go, as Korean immigrants go, their story is slightly unconventional in that they met and married here in America, not moving over as a family unit. But yeah, so I was born here in the States, and I live here in New Jersey.
My name is Kat Hampson. I shared a little bit last week. I am a Filipino. I was naturalized in the United States. I came here as a college student, grew up in the Middle East.
Well, great. I wanted to just get us going. Esther, I would like to ask you the first question, which is, what was your earliest experience with race growing up as an Asian American?
Yeah, let's see. I think it's hard to think way back when, not just because my memory is suffering because of the pandemic, which is too real. Like, I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. But when I was thinking about, when did I become aware of my race? And when I say race, I'm really talking about being Asian American, being a person of color. I think the prominent kind of themes I associate with my racial identity is one of marginality, meaning that I'm neither white nor black, neither kind of even having this perpetual outsider, perpetual foreigner feeling of like, oh, I'm not really from the US, even though I was born and raised in this country. And so I think growing up, I grew up in a predominantly white suburb about an hour south of Boston, so stayed pretty local most of my life. But I grew up, and from very early on, I knew that I didn't really feel similar to my predominantly white, classmates, whether it's in preschool or kindergarten. There were instances where I would get bullied because of the way that I, physically appeared. One time I was like in kindergarten, and my mom like put my hair in these like very, very dynamic pigtails. So it like literally was like horizontal from my head. But I remember these 2 kids just kind of sitting behind me on the bus, and they each took one and they pulled the other direction and called me an Asian Pippi Longstocking. What's it called? Pippi Longstocking. I think I didn't even know what that was growing up because my mom and dad were like, oh, we don't know anything about these American cartoons. But I had the kind of very distinct and very stark kind of realization that, oh, like people are picking me out because I was different in some way. And so, I had that experience of growing up and feeling like, oh, my Asianness is what marked me as different. And, as an elementary school kid, as a middle school kid, as a high school kid, kind of sticking out was one of my, greatest fears because I just wanted to blend in. And so I think, there's oftentimes this like lunchbox moment that some Asian American kids might have, right? I don't even know if like my mom packed me like Korean food. Like I can't even remember. Maybe I repressed it. But I remember like telling my mom in elementary school not to pack me kimchi or, other Korean foods, but instead to have this like very bland like peanut butter and fluff sandwich. And I was like, my mom probably had no idea what I was talking about, but I had this kind of strong assertion being like, oh, I gotta have what everyone else has. And everyone else around me was white. And so there was that kind of feeling of, oh, I'm not really quote unquote American, meaning I wasn't quote unquote white. But on the flip side, I grew up attending a predominantly Korean immigrant church in Quincy. And hey, yeah, small town, small world. And I grew up. It was an interesting kind of demographic. Like a lot of our first generation immigrant parents attended this church, and they had a Korean service. But then a lot of us second generation kids, a lot of us couldn't speak Korean, and so they created this like makeshift daycare, which became the English ministry at our church. And so I grew up feeling the sense of, oh, I wasn't Korean because I'm not part of the Korean service with my parents, or I couldn't speak the language, or there's a lot of kind of racial epithets that are spoken about being like a Twinkie or a banana, like all these things that I now cringe at when I think about it looking back. But yeah, I had this feeling that I was very just kind of an imposter, even within my own family. And so there's a sense of marginality there. And then, yeah, I mean, there's so much I could talk about, but I do really want to hear what everyone else also has to share.
Yeah, sir. I had a question, just a follow up. You had said so much like you just wanted to fit in and sort of not stick out. How successful do you think you were at that?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think I was very successful. I mean, growing up, I went to the same public school, like kindergarten through 12th grade. So I was with the same kids for all of my life growing up. And everyone knew me as that smart, nice, docile Asian girl that, was really good at math and science and wouldn't hurt a fly, right? And at the same time, like, I used to take pride in that identity of like, oh, like I am that, what you call the model minority. And at the same time, when I had experiences, whether it's related to mental health or thinking about my parents' kind of just struggles of realizing that the American dream that they had moved to the US for was not really quite in their reach for various reasons. I didn't have a voice to express some of that sadness or that frustration or the anger, or even felt like I had the space to speak up against all the microaggressions that I experienced.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
It is super exhausting. And as a kid, whether it's me as a kindergarten, like 6-year-old, or as a high school student, or even now sometimes, like as an adult, I kind of revert back to that small child within me being like, oh my God, I'm afraid of speaking up because what will the repercussions be?
Right.
Will I be kind of rocking the boat a little bit too much if I try to speak up as an Asian American? So yeah, I don't think I was very successful because I mean, you can't hide how you look, and people make assumptions all the time, regardless of like what my personal story might be. Like if I walk down the street in Boston or any city, people are going to read me a certain way and treat me in that way. And so, yeah, I don't think I was really successful. Maybe in one way of thinking like, oh, I was able to attain certain educational status, privilege, all that stuff. But the questions of what was the cost to kind of conform to that mono minority stereotype, I think that's oftentimes not discussed.
Greg, we're going to turn to you, but I'm seeing some of the comments in the Facebook chat, and I love just people interacting, telling us about your experience, about fitting in, and things like that. So just keep it up. Would love to just stay engaged, and our panelists will go back and read all the comments after this is recorded. But Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you grew up?
Yeah, thanks, and so glad to be here and hear and share stories with you all. So like I mentioned, I'm my parents are from Hong Kong. I'm Cantonese American, and I would say that my ethnic experience, right? So the shared people, shared story that I have that predates my racial awakening, right? So like I had an experience of being Chinese and Cantonese through food, through church. I grew up going to a largely Chinese and Chinese American church, and visiting family back home in Hong Kong. And so a lot of that was like I had this ethnic reality that was, I would say, largely positive, right, in my experience. And then I had this sort of like racial awakening that kind of became a larger and larger share of how I viewed my ethnic reality, right? So this racial piece being sort of like the cross-cultural, but sort of like this Europeanized concept of sort of like color and skin tone and how that relates to power, right? So in kindergarten, so Esther mentioned kindergarten. I was like, oh yeah, actually it's kindergarten for me too. And it's actually a story that my dad tells more than I remember, but he dropped me off at school one day, and apparently someone in my class, like within earshot of my dad, whose dad was also there, this kid said like, oh, like we have to play with kids like those kids too. Like, and so I don't remember this in the slightest, and I have no recollection. It's possible that I suppressed it and or the Lord kind of protected me from it. But my dad actually asked me a little bit later, "Hey, are kids at school nice to you?" And I didn't know why. I said, "Yeah, I mean, not like I think they are." And he kind of said, "Well, I heard this kid say this thing. I have no recollection of this whatsoever." But as we've kind of talked more about these sorts of things as I've gotten older, it's like, well, at the very least, it was there, even if I didn't know it was there, right? And as I've gotten older and grown up more and more, especially in grade school and middle school, I became increasingly conscious that it was there, and even sort of presuming that it would be there, right? And so I feel like my upbringing in, I grew up in a mostly white, fairly wealthy suburb of Boston, and a lot of my experience was that I was one of the only Asians of any kind in my setting. And it wasn't always hostile, but there was sort of like a difference, and not like positive uniqueness necessarily, just sort of like, well, I was just like on my own. And then I think in middle school, the kind of like, which I think often middle school is not pleasant for a lot of people, but like this social hierarchy and we would know now that these are microaggressive comments, right? But sort of like the ways that people talk to each other. We'd be playing in during recess, and jokes, ching chong, ice slant stuff comes out, and like I went to a extremely progressive, super progressive, expensive private middle school in Cambridge, right? And this stuff is still rampant, including by peers of mine who are Asian or mixed Asian, and actually adopted sort of these kind of microaggressive comments towards themselves. And so whether I agreed with it or not became less and less the point. I generally liked my Chinese family and my Asian church, and I liked my Chinese church. I had a largely positive experience of being Asian. But the more that I grew up, the more it felt like there was a liability to it in kind of shared multi-ethnic or mostly white spaces. And so over time, I began to say, well, this is the way it is. And if you can't kind of beat them, you should, join them, win. And so I think starting in high school, I really just said, like, I'm kind of tired of being stepped on and being considered unpopular and uncool. I'm not very tall. So if you just add that into sort of like the kind of like romantic popular sexual politic of how teenagers are, like just really far down the totem pole. And I really made it my high school endeavor to kind of like, I'm going to kind of rise above this, whatever that meant to me at the time. And so I went to a expensive preppy white boarding school, that the Bushes went to, and this sort of thing. Like, and so really like there's this opportunity really, and for this really sort of like carpe diem, kind of captain my captain opportunity to sort of like elevate yourself. That's the kind of the ethos of the school. And for me, that meant aspiring to whiteness. White aspirations almost completely my kind of a piece of my personality or kind of social type in high school. And for me that meant being good at sports and like trying to only date white women, right, because of what that said about me, right? And it's only looking back a lot later that I'm like, wow, I really bought into this idea that like being white was better, right? And I think on a functional level it was better because there was you didn't get bullied, you didn't get made fun of, you could go where you wanted to go, you could do what you wanted to do. But it was only much later that I'm like, that's kind of this unfortunate reality. And even though I was like successful at it, like Esther mentioned, there were costs to that, and there was sort of like a sort of an unhealthy way to look at myself and other people that I'm still in many ways like having to sort of not jump into, to not sort of like naturally presume. When I was in college, I had this internship at the State House on Beacon Hill, and all of the peers there, because it was like this political internship, right? So like in the State House, everyone was sort of like connected to Boston politics, which meant that they were like Irish or Italian. And so they had the Boston accent, which clearly I don't have. Like I don't have that. My parents don't have that. But I spent enough time around them that like, and it wasn't anything hostile towards them or me. It was not actually hostile, but I was so used to fitting into white spaces that I adopted it. So when I would leave the office, the accent was gone. By the time I got home, when I was in the office or when I would get coffee for one of the people, like my wife will still laugh at me because I do this when I'm in like a clearly locally owned, mostly white space. I will put on the Boston accent as if to subconsciously signal that I'm like we're conversant, right? I'm not a foreigner, right? So Esther kind of perpetual foreigner syndrome. Exactly. Yeah. So being good at it is also kind of costly and psychically not necessarily the healthiest thing. So I'm trying to kind of figure out a new relationship with some of those things. And but so that's a long answer to that question of where did I kind of grow up with it? Where did it kind of take me? Is in that some of that direction. I don't learn it later through college and after, which I'm thankful for. I can say more about that for now, but that's where it took me.
Yeah. Susan, do you want to share? I heard you kind of really resonating with the code switching part.
Well, there's a lot to resonate with. I also feel like it also started in elementary school. And I was thinking about my earliest memory of it. And I was like, oh, I remember those kids who made fun of my slanty eyes. And I actually remember getting in a fight. And so I got in a fight on the recess playground because this kid was making fun of my appearance and making fun of my eyes. And so I think I like kicked him or something. And then like we were pulled off each other, and the way like the recess line goes in, like the people who are going in trouble have to stand against the fence. And so the whole school is filing past me to go inside from recess. And as the Asian American, my face is like bright red, right? I'm just like,
Shame.
so much shame because you're standing there
Shame.
against the fence and everyone's walking past you like, how did you get in trouble? And then I got into the principal's office, and I just remember bursting into tears and being sent back to my teacher's office because they just didn't understand what had happened. And I just didn't even have the words to explain at the time that this white kid was being really racist. I think it's interesting. You guys had mentioned like going to church, because my family, we didn't grow up Christian. And so we didn't have like a family or a group of people who are Asian Americans that we could be with. And so I just remember my upbringing feeling very lonely as one of the very few Asian Americans that I knew. And so for me, I was basically completely just immersed in white spaces. And I very much wished, I remember just kind of growing up for years, wishing I was blonde haired and blue eyed. You know, I didn't, it took me until college to feel like I completely felt like, oh, God has made me this way and this is a good thing.
Yeah.
It just took me a long time because, you know, just years and years of that. And, so yes, elementary school. I still remember like walking home from middle school and like some high school kids calling out, "Hey, C word, go back to China." And I was like, I'm not from China. I'm from Taiwan. Right. But that wasn't like, which is.
Know your history.
Don't you know?
Read a map. Anyway.
But, you know, it just was. But it was, you know, I'm like 12 walking home and these high school kids and, you know, and there was some other high school kid who was like, "Hey man, leave her alone. She's just a kid." Right. But I was just like, wow, this is it. Right. This is what's like to grow up in suburban white America for us, for me, was to have to look across, you know, kind of look behind my back and be followed in the mall and other things. So. Yeah.
You know, Susan, you said that it wasn't until college that you really grew comfortable sort of in your Asian skin. And man, I think there are so many of us, including myself, that I feel like that came way later. You know, you were saying like, oh, college, it came so late. I was like, man, I wish I felt that comfortable in college.
Well, I can't say I did. Like, you know, like genuinely, like when I became a Christian in college, I joined the majority white fellowship because at MIT, when I was a student, there were several Asian fellowships, and I did not feel comfortable in them. Like I was like, "Oh, this is actually too many Asians," and so I actually felt more comfortable in the mostly white fellowship. And it wasn't until afterwards that being comfortable in mostly Asian spaces was okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. 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 Justin, I'm curious to know your experience, especially as you identified as an immigrant from South Korea. I guess my question is like, when did you immigrate? And then how did that experience, how was that experience in shaping kind of how you saw your cultural and racial identity in the United States?
Yeah, you know, I never said it this way, but race was always at the forefront of my life. And so even before I immigrated to the United States, I had a unique opportunity, thanks to my dad's job, to live in Hong Kong for 2 years when I was pre-K and kindergarten. And so I do distinctly remember my pre-K experience because we went to a Canadian private school. And so it was mostly white kids, and then there were sprinkles of Asians, you know, and also, so there were like Japanese kids, Chinese kids, you know, Korean kids, and Indian kids. And I remember this one girl who was white. There were 4 Korean kids, all boys. And so, you know, we look like each other. So, and we realized we can talk to each other. So we banded together, and I was hanging out this one time, probably doing, you know, making sandcastles or something. And the girl comes over and goes, "Speak English." like genuinely like mad at us for not speaking English in that space. And at that time, I, I was thinking, boy, I want to speak English to you. I really do. I don't know what to say. You know, like my mom told me, make sure you know, hi, my name is Hyungjun is my Korean name. Hi, my name is Hyungjun. And may I go to the bathroom? Those are the two things she equipped me with. And so, you know, I remember feeling, and she kept doing that to us. And another added layer to that is, you know, even within the Asian circles, we're 4 years old. I remember the Korean kids and the Chinese kids somehow banding together because they were the Japanese kids. So we could talk about this later, but we somehow had this shared understanding that they were the ones, or their, you know, ancestors were the ones who made our lives, our parents and their grandparents' lives harder. So there was like that ethnic stuff going on there too at age 4. So I would say that was my first experience. And then went back to Korea for a little bit, 3 years, came here. I immigrated to New Jersey. And I mean, my school was, I mean, there was maybe like 3 Asian kids. Yeah, I don't know, there were just not many. So when I went to school the first day, I was a spectacle to behold. You know? Thankfully, I do have to give credit to my neighborhood for the first 2 years. I think it was, they were obviously, you know, I had the lunch experience and all of that. But they were oddly very hospitable towards me. And I think when I think about it, it might have been because their parents and their grandparents were Italian Americans. So it might have come from, you know, who they were as immigrants and all that. So that was my first experience.
Kat, how about you?
So I shared a little bit about this last week. I grew up in the Middle East, child of 2 Filipino parents who immigrated there, and I stayed in the Middle East until I had to go to college. So race was there. I don't know if I would have articulated it in that way, but there was definitely that like racial hierarchy or like hierarchy of ethnicities, where folks who worked like construction or domestics, you know, service or those jobs were kind of on the lower end of this hierarchy. And for some reason, like white people were always at the top. And so these were the things I wrestled with, but I don't think I had the vocabulary or how to like name it. It just felt really uncomfortable. And I think there's part of Esther's story of like, you know, there's kind of marginality even within my own community, where in my case, like I didn't know my parents' native language growing up. And so, and my first language was English. And because there were a lot of white Americans in our church, I ended up with an American accent. And so there's me. And so when people, there were moments where kids at school would be like, so are you American? You don't look American. Are you trying to be? Like, what are you aspiring to be? And I think at that point I was like, I could have said like, yes, I want to be American.
Right.
That would just have made my life easier. But I think what I was actually saying in my head was like, I want to be white American. I want to be blonde. I want to be blue-eyed. I want to meet that standard. I don't want my life to be confusing anymore because I'm tired of this, like, who am I question. And I think it's been, it's been a journey coming to the States for college and then thinking about where kind of is my place in this larger conversation of race that's been going on. There's part of that. Richard, what about you?
Yeah, as I was, just hearing everybody's story, and thank you guys so much for sharing. I thought of this sort of continuum of fitting in, and for whatever reason, the town that I lived in had a lot of Asians, even way back when. I think I'm older than everybody here, and so but we had a lot of Asians. And I remember actually very early on, one of my earliest memories was in first grade. My friends created this, my nickname was Aleo. I don't know, don't ask, right? But it was like this Aleo association. And it was literally like Friends of Richard, right? Like, and if you were cool enough to be friends with Richard, then you were in this, and like became this thing where I was like the sort of divining rod of whether you were like cool or not. And I remember thinking, actually, at first grade, like, why me? Like, that's so strange, and I couldn't really comprehend it. And so I actually was like very accepted, very assimilated very early on. And I fought hard to stay there. And so I was very mean to anybody that I didn't like, because I felt like as long as I am pointing at you and putting you down, I get to stay on top. And so, you know, I mean, it made me into a pretty terrible child to be around.
You've been redeemed.
But you know, I mean, I've grown out of all of it for sure. But the thing that I keep going back to is that you have this person, this child, who's like pretty popular and like, you know, gets around school and like people, you know, want to be friends with him. And I never had people over. I never invited my friends over because I was ashamed of my refrigerator. I was afraid, I was offended of my parents' accent.
Oh, the smell in the house.
Oh, I mean, I was afraid to ask them to take off their shoes. I mean, all of it, right? The artwork on the walls, the blankets on the beds. I mean, all of it, right? I mean,
Yes.
I mean, I hope that
reading into my experience right now, like, whoa.
I hope the comment section is saying something, because I know you guys had funky blankets and smelly food. But I think,
food, though.
yeah, right. But I think back to it now and go, man, I was ashamed. And here's a deeper level. I think I was mad at my parents because I was like, I did it, right? Like, I made it in school. Like, I'm assimilated. Like, why can't you guys assimilate? Why can't you, you know? And like, in my 8-year-old mind or 7-year-old mind, like, I'm putting that blame on my parents. And I'm almost saying like, hey, this is a part of my life that like, I don't want people to see. Like, I want them to see me at school. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we're all just working that out, right? Like, I mean, it's all just kind of coming up in these conversations.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, for folks, what, just how, was there either a moment or a process of awakening for you in your journey of you know, cultural, racial identity formation? Did you hit a place of dissonance where you were like, this is really awkward and hard, and is there a better way? Susan, you want to go first?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, you were asking the question of like my own cultural identity, and you know, I think it just came along the way as I was just, I think part of it, I actually needed just to, like, I think one of the processes they say is like, you need to immerse yourself in your own culture. And so I did. And I remember several years after college, you know, I spent a lot of time mostly with Asian Americans, just kind of realizing, oh, they get my jokes. And we have this thing about food and all these other things that just felt so like, I just felt so normal. Right. And so it was in that space, in that safe space where I learned more about myself and my own culture and realizing, oh, the ways that I felt dissonance and aloneness and confusion growing up is actually a normative experience for other people too. And it wasn't just my own experience. But as far as like understanding kind of race and the racial hierarchy and just kind of race in general in America, I think honestly, as much as I'm embarrassed to say how late it took me until Tamir Rice's shooting that I really came to understand, oh, this is not, there's no fairness there, right?
Yeah.
So ways in which, like he was shot after arriving on scene 2 seconds, right? Like it just is, it was this understanding that a child can be shot for essentially being Black, playing on the street. And I think that was when I finally understood, like, there's something else going on here besides just my own sense of being an immigrant feeling different from American culture, not being white. That's when I finally kind of like I kind of knew it, but I don't think I fully understood it until that moment when I finally understood, oh, something's really jacked up here.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead, Esther.
No, I just well, so many things that you said, Susan, I just really resonate with. I think for me, my moment of awakening definitely happened in college. I definitely think of it as like an intervention that I had an Asian American studies professor pretty early on in my undergrad experience. And it was due to her class and the learning that we did, and really kind of coming to terms with the structural realities of what it's like to live in the US as a person of color. I think that was my awakening into the experience of like, oh, it's not just me kind of navigating this world on my own as a solitary Asian American woman, but it's really how have these structures and systems of white supremacy and of racialized capitalism really pit people against each other, and how we operate within this larger system of anti-Blackness and police brutality. And kind of, I think like for me, there's even thinking about what's happening this past year with the murder of George Floyd and just the uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes. None of this is new. And so I think like whenever we kind of come to awareness of what's going on, the injustice of, children being shot dead on the street because of the color of their skin, I think for me in college, if I didn't have like the mentorship of my professors and a community of peers to really reckon with this together, I don't know if I would kind of be where I am today. Right. Yeah. And I remember, I think it was like 2014 with the uprising in Ferguson, and being on the streets in Boston with my friends in these like American studies classes, and kind of being on the front lines and seeing just a lot of young people around me, and all of us were, just trying to make sense of what's going on, and just kind of seeing similar scenes kind of play out in this current moment. I don't really know if there's really a linear journey of like what it means for me to become like awakened, or with the hashtag term woke of what that means. I think it's, for me, it's more kind of circular. We revisit some themes and systems and structures, and with each kind of revisiting process, we gain a deeper understanding of, what is like to empathize with people across differences. And for me, how is my Asian American experience, and maybe the invisibility that I felt, or the silencing that I felt, how is that actually a strategic part of this larger system of white supremacy, and not just a side effect?
Yeah.
Come on.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
I'm just getting started.
Esther went deep.
Now she's going to take over and preach.
I'll just leave.
Yeah.
We just turn off our cameras and Esther can preach.
I love that you named that it's not a linear thing. There's this revisiting that happens. There's that moment of dissonance, and then I think on your part, you were invited to engage, to lean in, to hold those spaces, and then in that act of coming and leaning in and saying, I'm going to look for that, whether it's solidarity or just even understanding how to make sense of Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, how do I make sense of this? There's a coming back to your story and saying, oh, there are elements of this I didn't see before. And now it's placed in a larger context of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. That was also kind of my moment of awakening, just the uprisings and Michael Brown and Eric Garner. And I think I'd noticed a lot of my really well-meaning white friends saying things like, hold on, like, let's wait for all the evidence. Like, we don't know everything just yet. And my first reaction was to be like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Like, you want to be objective and all that. And then I at this point in time, I also noticed my Black friends like lamenting and mourning and saying like, my brother's autistic, this could have happened to him. And like, these are our brothers and fathers and mothers and sisters. And then so that for me was my dissonance of like, hey, wait a minute, there are two Americas going on. And am I so fully entrenched in one that I can't see the pain of the other?
Right.
and that was a moment where God used people in my life to be like, hey, what are you not seeing? Yeah. So anyone want to jump in and share kind of either their moment or their process? Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk a little bit. So, like I mentioned earlier, I felt like I had been maybe ultimately to my detriment, like ultimately pretty successful at kind of working through it and doing well in kind of a white cultural system, like, getting the jokes, all that sort of thing. And I think in college, I began to realize that this wasn't maybe the most necessary and certainly Christian thing. Like, why do I actually feel the need to do this? And I kind of noticed that even in Christian settings, there were white people who I went to college with, who I was friends with, and even some who I wasn't, who would sort of like always reserve the right to kind of make side microaggressive kind of comments about me or people in my fellowship, which ended up being mostly Asian, which was not actually a choice that I felt like I wanted to make, but that's its own story for another time. And I was like, why did you feel the need to do that? Why do you have that right? And should you actually have that as a Christian? Just like realizing there was this real dissonance there. And so I began to realize, like, I think I have critiques of who we are as people, Asian and Asian Americans, and even our churches, right? And I think many of us may resonate with, like, oh yeah, there's lots to say about our families, our churches, Asian American culture systems, that it's not always perfect, and it doesn't always reflect God in an entirely holy way, right? But I had all these critiques, and I was like, I think I actually don't only have critiques, I think I have condescension towards my own people. I think I have self-hatred. And I began to notice this because one of my friends who I knew from one of these other kind of shared Christian spaces, he's Black, and we began to talk about his life and his church experience and his family. And he did not, in his case anyway, he did not have correlating self-hatred about his own people. He had critiques, but he didn't have self-hatred. And I was like, that's interesting. I don't know why are we different in this way? So as he kind of shared more about his own story and we talked about life and family, I began to realize I've inherited self-hatred from someone else. I didn't get that. That's actually not the same thing as actually having, holy discontent with the way that generational sin looks like or whatever it is. So it wasn't until the end of college that I realized that, I've really bought into something that's really not really genuine to who God would call me to be, and sort of began to be open to kind of changing some things. I actually joined ministry. Some of you know that I work for University Christian Fellowship, and through my kind of journey there, began to really see there are some like real, much more ugly sides to some of the way that even Christian spaces were kind of ruled by white and white supremacist cultural concepts, which some of them weren't necessarily evil, but they also just weren't scripture. Like they just weren't the same thing as godliness. And so I was like, man, I've really bought into more and more things, even in a spiritual lens. And that kind of led me to kind of think differently, think creatively about, well, what would it mean to be Asian without self-hatred? What would it mean to actually work on the stuff that we want to work on, right? Critique-wise, right? But then actually imagine something that's positive or creative that actually is part of a larger kingdom picture, right? Of who we're supposed to be alongside other kind of peoples. And then, of course, I was actually at the University of Virginia for 7 years, right? That's a university that's built by slaves, owned by the president of the university, right? And so deeply embedded in its actual construction is America's racial history of slavery. And kind of watching the ways that was embedded in the institution in the town, realizing like, me being Asian doesn't actually spare me from any of the kind of damage that I see kind of around me. And also as a Christian, like maybe I should care about that, So I think that's where I began to have that. So around the time, some of you mentioned, Ferguson and some of the events around that was a period where I'd already been in this sort of like, I think I have some discontent with what it means to be living in America and living as the children of immigrants and like the Asian American dream, and like how much is it that is actually a dream versus sort of like a bad deal or maybe a nightmare for some of us, And I think that's where I said, there's a bigger picture that actually my dissonance fits into a larger experience of dissonance that I think we see in the United States, right? That everyone has a different shade of it, but I think even with my friend who's Black at Duke, just talking about his own, I have critiques, but I don't have self-hatred. I was like, oh, we actually have different ways of looking at ourselves, how we've bought into or been hurt by these larger cultural experiences, and racial experiences. I have to reckon with that, So I don't know if that makes sense as an answer, but hopefully it connected with some of you all. But that's my story. Yeah.
No, that's great. It's great. I think of I'll share real quick, and then we can pivot to a new question. But I think of a lunch that I had with a good friend of mine who's white, and we were engaged in a conversation about white and Black racism that was going on in America. It may actually have been around Ferguson. It may have been around Tamir Rice. It may have been around, some of these other moments where you guys are talking about. And I remember I had lunch with this person, and like I said, I mean, we're really good friends. And and he says sort of offhanded, I mean, I've always thought of you as white.
Heard that one before.
And I was like totally taken aback. I did not know, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what that, I was like, is that a compliment? Or is that the most racist thing I've ever heard?
Both.
It is both, right, Susan? You're right. And it was really, I think for me, it was this deep division in my soul of the race conversation, because again, we were having a black and white conversation, and he said, if I'm going to put you on a side, I'm going to put you on this side. And that to me was like, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how I feel about, and it was like, you're not threatening, and, you know, you're acceptable, and, you know, you're tolerable, and all of those things. And I was like, oh, no. Like, this is not okay. And even if I am accepted, and mind you, I can't even blame him, because that's how I lived my life. I mean, that was my goal in life, was to be accepted and to be seen as white. And so in some ways it was like, you succeeded. But I was like, oh, no. This is not the answer. Like, I've seen the other side. Like, I've made it to the top, and I'm like, no. This is not where I want to be. And especially in the black and white conversation. And so, you know, I'd love to hear from the rest of you guys. When you think back to 2020, when you think about Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and you think about, you know, the COVID virus from China, and you think of Kung Flu, and you think of the anti-Asian racism, how has all of that, the last, you know, 12 months, really helped shape and push you in engaging with your cultural or racial identity in America?
So I'll start us off there. I think it came off to me that, you know, it's undeniable now. You know, these things are on video. You know, it's not just some angry black people, angry Asians saying this happened and there's no evidence. Like, look at the video, man. And, you know, just to point out, I mean, I was kind of engaging with the whole conversation still at like a distant level until last week. So let me tell you what happened last week. Very classic story, but you know, we like to believe Boston is a pretty progressive city in the United States, right? So we don't need to kind of think about that so close. Well, I mean, sure, yeah, there's something up in Boston Globe that says otherwise.
Yeah.
I'm at H Mart, and it's an Asian market in Burlington, Massachusetts, and there was like some altercation that was happening, and that never happens at H Mart. So I'm getting out for my cashier, and then this woman, she probably was like a sophomore in college, follows this white woman and says, "I just need an apology." And I just keep like, like literally last Tuesday we had this conversation. So I'm just like, oh gosh. And I found out she had picked up a tomato and then put it back because she realized her mom didn't need another tomato. And then this white lady followed her and said, "Don't do that." And she's like, I don't need it. And she basically, this is the whole Kung Flu thing. That's disgusting. I'm a physician. You should not do that. And so she's like, okay. And so she turned around. She literally took the tomato and threw it at her. and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like too close to home. And so like, as I think about that experience and George Floyd and all that, like, I can't not pay attention anymore. Basically, that's like how I came to the conclusion. Like, I can't not pay attention. And you know, as a Korean who came from Korea, I said in the beginning that race was always, you know, in front of me. And some of my cultural identity stuff has been born out of the tension that I felt as a Korean, as I related with Korean Americans too. So if Richard and I, Richard and I were in the same school, same age, I would have had some issues with Richard and Esther. And there was just so many things that were unspoken of, and my parents were like, go make friends with them, and I'm like, but they ain't the same, you know, like we're so different. And so as I thought about 2020, I started to really replay, going back to what Esther said, right? It's like like replay all those things and say, okay, if this is how I felt throughout my life, how much more would a Black person have experienced? And so it's like growing in empathy and like saying, this is no longer invisible. So just start to acknowledge that, hey, Justin, it's there. Hey, everybody else, it's there. And we have to do the work to understand our cultural, ethnic, racial identities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways, you know, like Black and brown brothers and sisters, you know, they've worn this path, you know, for so much longer, and in different ways that, you know, they may not react to a tomato being thrown as dramatically as, you know, I do, because, you know, they're seeing, you know, different types, or they're, you know, seeing it in different ways. But I think what we're seeing is that very thin veil that we were, as Asian Americans, sort of like hiding behind in some ways. That veneer is gone. And we're thrust into that conversation, and I think in a good way. I think it's driving engagement, and not allowing us to be this sort of silent minority anymore. Esther, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I feel like I can just like sit here and listen all day, and then kind of thinking of what to share or like what stories to share. I think that can be a whole nother time too. But you know, we're kind of touching upon a theme of, you know, what it's like to be desensitized to this ongoing kind of structural oppression, or just kind of the very stark interpersonal violence that we can see, you know, with the tomato being thrown in H Mart. You know, for me, like I've grown up getting like either catcalled or, you know, people yelling across the street, being like, go back to where you came from, you like insert racial slur, regardless of, you know, what my actual ethnicity is. You know, it's like whatever that person, you know, feels to like say to me. And also it's really connected, honestly, to like the newsreel. And like, if like, for example, in the US, if they're having certain like foreign military affairs with like Korea, Japan, China, like there's an uptick in violence related to that as well. But I think like for me, when I think about like the desensitization, I often think about actually my immigrant parents. You know, oftentimes their voices and their narratives don't get shared in these conversations of what it means to be Asian American. But, you know, I've had conversations, you know, during college and after college where we really butt heads a lot, you know, where I'm getting politicized and I'm like, you know, I'm going to these, you know, protests, and my mom's like, I follow you on Facebook, don't go to those protests. And she's like, you don't know what you're getting yourself into, you know. And for the longest time I was like, oh my God, it's just because my parents are conservative, they just don't understand where I'm coming from, they're from a different generation, you know, X, Y, and Z. But it wasn't until junior and senior year of college when I did this family oral history project where, you know, I literally just sat down and interviewed my mom and my dad and my grandmother about their lived experiences, you know, prior to immigrating. And I realized after those conversations that I really didn't know who my parents were or why they are the way that they are. You know, I really only knew them as these kind of distant parental figures who, like, based on a lot of like self-reflection now, I realized like, oh, I just projected a lot of my like kind of anti-Asian sentiment or self-hate upon my parents. And I blame them for what is actually a larger structural issue of why are they being so marginalized or, you know, not kind of seen as kind of a part of the US, right? And so I think all that to say, kind of hearing my parents' experiences of a lot of the adversity that they lived in Korea, you know, they grew up in a post-Korean War era. You know, my mom was like actually a really active student organizer with, you know, responding against the military regime of President Park Chung-hee. And like, she was talking about seeing her upperclassmen kind of, friends getting really brutalized by the police. And so when she was saying to me like, oh, like, I don't go to those protests, like it might have been kind of a combination of like her watching Fox News, because that's what she put on, in the evenings, but it's also stemming from her own kind of personal trauma and her own experiences that oftentimes we never even know where to begin to kind of ask those questions of, what did you go through? And I don't know, I think when I think about, this current moment of 2020 of kind of thinking about the national reckoning that we're going through with what it means to be an American, what it means to live in this country that is still dealing with the legacy of racism, white supremacy. Right. I really think about like the need for Asian Americans, myself included, to really share our stories and to kind of have that space to think about and to really be real with one another of, why maybe if we haven't been involved, like why haven't we been involved in these conversations prior to this? And yeah, I think like there's a lot of, when you learn about Asian American history, there's a lot of really inspirational kind of moments of coalition building, of Asian Americans being in solidarity with other people of color and vice versa as well. But oftentimes we don't learn about those histories. And so I think there is this still fighting against the stereotypes of Asians being the model minority, of being submissive, of being silent, when in fact there have been people throughout history and in recent times who have been challenging that stereotype.
This is tremendous. I see a lot of people, kind of affirming, encouraging, asking questions, sharing their stories in the comments, and I want, for everyone who's joining in, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for just in the places and spaces where you are, leaning in and listening and engaging. I can sense that there are that we have a lot of feelings about this. And I appreciate how we're bringing them to the table, bringing them to each other and saying, hey, let's journey together in this. So I just want to pull some questions that people are asking and share them to the panelists to respond. Forgive me as I am looking through them super quick. Again, love the comments, but gonna sort through them. I know there are. So one question is, what are ways to respond when actually confronted by racism in the streets? What would you actually say and do? Curious to know actual words that someone has used or stories even.
We're looking for helpful answers, right?
I mean...
I'm going to call my wife in. She has probably better answers than I do.
Well, I'll just start us off again. So when that happened last week, I told my wife, and she was just kind of like laughing at me, because part of me was wrestling with that exact tension, like don't butt in, like let the police handle. But then I realized, okay, but which police is gonna say a white policeman? Right. What kind of policeman, Yeah. And so I literally got to my car, put my stuff down, and I was like praying. I'm like, Lord, I'm not sure how to respond right now. But I do know that when I think about Jesus, like he just went and just was there. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to put my stuff down. I'm going to go back and just be near what's going on. And I was just ready to advocate for that particular family to whichever, authority was coming, and just wanted to keep checking in of like how the parents were experiencing this and how the person, and she got at the very end, go back to where you came from. And that just blew her up. And so I just wanted to be like, hey, I recognize what you just felt. And this is the Asian in her. She's like, I'm so sorry. Like, and I'm like, no, what? Yeah. You don't say sorry in this case at all. And so I just wanted her to have that, to say, like, what you experienced was wrong. You don't have to, rationalize it in any way.
Yeah, I'm much better if I see it done to someone else. I will step in and I will like stand in the gap and I'll say, hold on, no, that's not. If it's done to me, like it's a different story, you know, like because I like in some ways I'm like I fight against the characterization of Asians as being quiet and docile, and so I will raise my voice and be like, wait. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What did you say? You know, like, because I want to draw attention to it in some ways. And I don't necessarily advocate this as the best way, but I do think that there's a sense in which, okay, I'm going to tell this story. There was, I was dropping my daughter off at dance, and there was an Asian woman walking her daughter through the driveway. And there was a, you know, wealthy white woman, you know, no offense to wealthy white women, but there was a wealthy white woman who happened to be, you know, in, you know, Range Rover or something like that. And as she was just walking across the driveway, and the white woman honked the horn like really rudely. And immediately I was like, if she weren't Asian, I wonder if she would have honked. And it was just this thing that I was like, ugh, like, I felt like there's something about the fact that the expectation is you're not going to do anything about it. And there's a part of me that wants to flip that narrative and to say, no, like I will say something about it. I will do something about it. And it's tough. It's tough to know, you know, what the situation is. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
I think there are ties with gender as well. And I admit that I wish that there were snappier, you know, comebacks that I could have had for people who are like, oh my goodness, I love Filipinos. And then spews out a whole bunch of stereotypes. Like, I wish I could be like, no, and I'm going now. But there, I like in that moment, I know that I'm like, okay, smile because I need to survive. And this is exhausting and I don't want to spend time with you. So I'm going to try and get myself out of here as safely as possible. But so, and I think I do wrestle with that kind of like, should I have said more? Wow, shame. Wow, self-loathing. But at some point I'm just like, hey, I needed to survive in that moment and that did not feel safe.
Yeah.
No, I definitely resonate. I feel like in the moment, like you do what you need to do to be safe. And that's like the first priority. And I think there are moments when if I would see something happen across the street or see something in like the MBTA, you know, sometimes like I don't do this often because a lot of times I tend to be very conflict avoidant given my just like upbringing, and it's kind of something I'm working on. It's a growth edge.
Yeah.
It's fighting against my social isolation as a woman. But I think like oftentimes what I've seen other people do or I've heard from my friends and you know what I've done maybe once or twice is like instead of directing my attention to the aggressor, I direct my attention to the person who's being aggressed upon, asking, are you okay? Do you want support? And honestly, like getting more people into the situation, like if you see something going on, like there's strength in numbers. So like you don't have to be, if you don't feel safe individually going and addressing the racist, you know, bring in more people, get that on like camera, get that on video. And I think also like oftentimes in the moment we feel so elevated and escalated in our emotions. So like sometimes the words just don't come out, but saying something, anything, just like marking that incident, disrupting the flow of what's going on, like that, it can also mean a lot. That can give someone the time to kind of regather themselves and to get to a more safe place. And so, there's kind of a lot of different tactics. You know, there's also like de-escalation trainings that people can go to if they're interested. Yes, by Hollaback, you know, there's some great nonprofits who are doing this kind of work. And we could definitely share more resources later about that. But yeah, just kind of speaking up, saying something, anything to mark the situation and bringing in more people. I think that's been helpful for me.
Yeah, letting them know they're not alone.
Right.
Question about, I think from Tiffany, what is left out or sacrificed in being grouped into POC terminology? What would make it better in terms of grouping labels for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? So it's a question of like, do AAPI identify as people of color? What are the conversations around that?
And there's a lot of like sub questions, so it's taken me a while to just
Yeah,
figure out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Big question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the labeling itself, like the endeavor to label, is problematic just even on its face, right? I mean, to put all Black people in the same experience, to put all Latinx people in the same experience, to put all Asian Americans in the same experience, it's a fallacy, right? Same thing with white people, and so I think that the Asian Americans grouping themselves and labeling, being grouped as people of color, I think is in some ways a reaction to the sort of white assimilation that has happened and almost weaponizing of Asian Americans as a model minority over and against people of color. And so I think that there's it's a reaction to a racial narrative in society, right? Like if we were building it from a ground up, I don't think we would draw these lines. And so for me, I think if it's more about identifying ourselves as allies to those that are being oppressed in our society more than it is sort of alliances and allegiances of races, because I think Pastor Dave actually talks about this, but like it's not about denying privilege, it's about how we leverage our privilege, whatever privilege we have, and whether we have a lot of privilege or whether we don't have a lot of privilege, it's using that for other people, in society.
Yeah, I think with any type of group categorization, we lose sight of the individual details and experiences that are unique, right? Within any type of group label, and even within Asian American Pacific Islander, there's such a kind of a diverse array of experiences. But I'm reminded of actually the historical origin of the term Asian American. It's not just something that like Asian Americans were like one day like, oh, we're just gonna call ourselves Asian American because like we're Asian and we're American. Like, no, there's more kind of a political kind of purpose in the term Asian American, and so it goes back to some of the late 1960s social movements, and particularly the student organizing in San Francisco State University to establish the ethnic studies department. And that ethnic studies refers to just kind of curriculum learning and teaching that really centers the experiences of oppressed people. And that's kind of a response against the predominantly white centric curriculum that was being taught in colleges and is still being taught a lot in a lot of spaces today, but the term Asian American, it refers to a political coalition of people from different, Asian ethnic backgrounds, whether it's Korean, Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, coming together and saying like, hey, we do have some shared experiences of living underneath US militarism and imperialism and white supremacy, that like, this is how we can band together and have strength in numbers to stand alongside our Black and brown brothers and sisters who are also fighting for their liberation. And so again, it's really about how are we creating those bridges together, identifying the commonalities, and not necessarily seeking to erase the differences, but really embracing the differences and bringing that into the movement, right? And so when I think about identities, I'm really thinking about for what purpose are we identifying? I can identify as Asian American. I can identify as a mom, as a sister, not a mom, actually, I don't have kids, but as a sister. I don't know where that came from.
Everyone who knows Esther is like, what?
Is this an announcement?
We got the real to my thinking. Anyway, but like identities, these are social categorizations. Like sometimes we forget that race is a social construct. It was an idea that was created by man for a political purpose that capitalized on physical appearances. So like, with any type of social construct, it's created by people. And so when we think about what are the benefits of identifying as people of color, again, there's that strength in numbers of calling out how we're all not benefiting from white supremacy, and that, we need to stop pitting ourselves against each other, but really looking at where the power is being protected, right? And so, there's pros and cons to choosing to look at certain commonalities versus focusing on certain differences. But I feel like that's another conversation. Yeah.
So let's I know that our time is limited, and it's been absolutely wonderful to be with you. So I do want to move the conversation forward to kind of thinking about next steps for you as each of you as panelists. But what next steps do you also have for Highrock? Greg, next steps for you. Just as you've grown in your kind of own racial identity and privilege, what steps are you taking to either further understand identity or kind of heal from, the feelings that you brought up, or kind of lean into solidarity? Where do you find yourself?
That's good. I'll try and be succinct. So I think about some of like the healing from kind of racial trauma and kind of racial narratives around sort of like self-hatred. I'm in therapy. I have a spiritual director. I have disciplers. Like I'm kind of attacking it from all angles. Like I want my soul to be shaped the way that God has intended for it to be, which includes removal of narratives that are particular to race and to ethnicity and to kind of Asian specific self-hatred. Right. So so any of those methods. I think in the positive sense, I'm trying to learn what it means to kind of create or imagine a positive whole redeemed Asian Americanness and Chinese Americanness. So I'm a father. My wife and I have a son who's 7 months old, and I think about like, I can't obviously protect him from everything, but like, what would it look like to kind of raise him in a household that has a whole and holy view of one's own heritage and as well as other people, right? So what does it mean to actually imagine positively an Asian American family experience that kind of constructs, that builds up, that edifies? And I think about things that my parents have done that were really good, and I want to keep some of those things and things that I've learned along the way that maybe my parents didn't do, and I also want to kind of implement or kind of experiment with. And so I pray for grace in that. When I think about sort of for Highrock, I guess I'll speak to us as Asian Americans or Asian Americans in Highrock. I don't know that we're all us, right? I don't know that many of you as a whole. I'm relatively new to the church. I think it would be important to own that we don't simply attend this particular congregation. Like we're not just sort of like incidentally attending this particular church, right? We actually take up space, and that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what we do with it, right? So I think that there and as I've read some of the comments, like I think people have like, it really sounds like lots of engagement, which I think is really fantastic. We need to keep engaging and realizing that we're not incidentally Asian, we're not incidentally here. Like the heritage of Highrock is that it was a predominantly Korean group of Christians who tried to kind of imagine a way forward out of a particular kind of Asian specific Christian background that they felt they didn't know what to do with, right? And so I believe there's a lot of hope in that, but I think that we've not simply arrived. Like we need to think about what does it mean as Asian Americans? What kind of space do we hold? What kind of space do we hold for other people? Are we conscious of the way that our cultural selves bless or hinder other people, right? And so I think, and I think the silencing thing is actually one of the greatest misfortunes, because silence is the removal, right? It's a removal of the possibility of contribution. So there are lots of wonderful things about being Asian. Some of them that come to mind easily are sort of hospitality, empathy, considering the needs of other people, etc. Right? But I think if we are silent, then we don't actually jump in. We sort of say, well, someone else will take care of it, I guess. And actually, like I think that actually we have a lot to bring to the table, right? And then, but do we also think about, are we making room for other people who might not be like us, right? Whether that's class-wise, culturally, familially, stage of life-wise, etc. Right? And so I don't say that in a kind of a polemical, critical way, but I find that when we keep to ourselves, when we kind of stay in our lane, we actually narrow our own lane and the lanes for other people. When actually, if we were kind of more fully owning who we are and our story and our healing and our gifts, we actually would actually expand the way that our church space could be a blessing to people. So I just want to encourage us that actually having conversations like this, like I don't see this as being this kind of conversation can come up in our small groups, right? Like in the small group that my wife and I lead, and Esther's part of it, like, we're just as liable to talk about sort of an interpretation of the text and the scripture and like cultural application in the book of James as we are to like, this reminds me of my parents and my family and myself and my sister and my cousin, whatever, right? Because actually when we talk about application, there is a spiritual kind of overlay. So I think there's something connected there that we shouldn't see this as like a separate sidebar conversation. It actually is part and parcel to our discipleship, to our community, to our ministry. And so I just want to encourage people to kind of think that way, that we want to bring our full selves to this fellowship and this church.
Bring
state.
our whole selves. Yeah. Susan, what do you think? What next steps are there for you?
Next steps for me. I think there's two things. I think one thing is just continuing to lean into learning. I've just been doing a lot of reading. Reading Austen Channing Brown. My first book, just so it's a book plug, but I just want to warn you, it's a heavy book, is The New Jim Crow. It will really help you understand that there are two Americas in this country, but it's also a very heavy book. Reading Austen Channing Brown recently, I'm reading Reading While Black, which is a book on kind of the Black perspective on theology. So I've just been doing a lot of reading on just kind of understanding kind of the kaleidoscope of how we understand being American in this country, and also just and as someone who's a minister, I work with InterVarsity. Part of it's also for me understanding the kaleidoscope of theology perspectives, like theological perspectives that people see in scripture, and the ways that, for example, a Black person will read scripture differently than the way I've been taught, and just how rich that is. And so part of it's been just learning, and I think part of it's also just been using my voice. So for me, particularly, again, in ministry, I am a person of color, but I am supervising a team that's mostly white. And so part of it has been actually engaging not just my team, but just colleagues in general, white colleagues particularly, in conversations about race, just recognizing that it's a hard conversation, and trying to kind of be kind of a helpful person that they can ask questions to, and just to give people grace in helping them like try and fail at this conversation. So so that's part of it. Also just kind of trying to come alongside friends and just helping them process these conversations, and trying to create a safe space for them. And also for myself, I mean, I'm continuing just to engage my colleagues and friends who are Black in particular, and just trying to understand my own space and how I can be an ally to them, and often making mistakes and saying, okay, something happened in that meeting, for example, at work, and someone said something, I can see that afterwards you were really pissed, and I tried to step in and I don't think I did it right. So tell me more about how I could have helped you, and things like that. And so part of it is debriefing my friends afterwards, but part of it's also just recognizing that I need to show up for my Black colleagues when things happen. So yeah, this one, I agree with Greg as far as kind of next steps for Highrock. I think for all of us, particularly for Asia and Americans in the church, I do think that we have a place in this conversation about race, but I think we also have an opportunity to help bridge the conversation, and to really kind of make it wider and more wonderful. So Justin, do you want to go next?
Oh yeah, sure. For me, going along the lines of what Greg said, I think before I couldn't see the image of God in the Korean culture because of a lot of things. But recognizing every culture reflects the image of God.
Yes.
Yes.
And every culture needs redeeming. There's sin in there. And so for me, the work is reading and thinking and like parsing out what are those things that we can celebrate and what are sins we can own as Koreans, So there's that work that I do. Yeah. And so, for Highrock, I if you're white American, I can imagine how it's difficult for you right now, because we have a cancel culture we're dealing with just at large. Yeah. And so you probably have to tiptoe so many ways. But what we can offer as a community, as Jesus followers, and say, hey, Jesus is at the center. So let's have that at the center and move forward together. We are all going, like, I'm asking awkward questions to my Black friends. I feel so bad. We will all fumble with our words. And it's so easy to feel that we can't say anything, but can we agree to fumble forward? Just fumble forward, because I realize there's so much more at stake than what meets our eye right now. And so, and it really has a lot to do with our identity as Jesus followers. And then the second thing, in addition to that, to my white American friends, and I'll just say this. I will challenge you as you enter these conversations, and especially enter conflicts with curiosity rather than criticism. And we can go into a whole how Asians deal with things and like how we are, brought up. But in the name of critiquing things, I've seen white Americans make harmful judgments on people, create more unnecessary conflicts, or silence people. And so again, I'm not trying to silence white Americans. I'm saying as body of Christ, let's do it together, but with a posture of curiosity.
Yeah.
So good.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and just one more thing. Like I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my white colleagues giving me space and relinquishing a certain level of power and control. I know it can be scary to do that, but I'm asking you to do that.
Yeah. Esther.
Sure. I'm just reminding myself of the questions, just in general of like what steps I'm taking to kind of continue on this journey. I think I resonate with a lot of what people have shared. Therapy has played a huge role in giving myself a safe space to just kind of process a lot of stuff, even starting to speak to break some silences around some of my like childhood experiences and like how I've come to understand who I am and who I want to be moving forward, and knowing that is kind of malleable. And so definitely might be kind of biased because I work in the counseling field, but I definitely think that everyone should go to therapy. Everyone would benefit. And then another thing is kind of similar to what Greg and Susan was sharing, finding community, whether that is within small groups or having a group of people, friends together, just to do some shared learning together and shared reflection on how are you making sense of whether it's learning about structural kind of systems of white supremacy and racism, or learning about some Asian American history, and really kind of helping to challenge some of the notions that, Asians haven't been part of building this, this country, which, fact check, we have, we have some really significant contributions to building this country and moving this country towards justice. So a quick plug in terms of a resource, if you're more into watching documentaries, the PBS released a series called Asian Americans. It's a 5-part tour de force that brings you through 200 plus years of Asian American history. And so I definitely would highly recommend that as a starting point. And yeah, just kind of continuing to do that self-reflection and even learning about your own histories. The work of doing my own family oral history in college really catapulted me into where I am today, about not being afraid to ask questions to my family members and peers, and keep continuing to break the silences and bring our voice back into the space when there's so many forces that have kept us out. So that's kind of what I will do continuing forward, and I look forward to kind of being on this journey with everyone here to do that.
I can only just ditto and echo and amen to everything you all said. All that is incredibly important, and I'm honored to be a sojourner with you in this. Richard, I'll leave it to you to close.
Yeah, as I think about this answer, right, how do we move forward as a church? I think so much of what we think about church, and really in some ways so much of what we've lost in or we feel this void in virtual church is this idea of community, right? Having to sort of reclaim this idea of community. Yeah. And I just can't help but think that the way that we move forward as a church, as an organization, as a workplace, as an individual, as a family, as a community, is that word community. And I would say give you 3 practical things. I would say if you're majority white, if you're a white person or you find yourself in power, I've had white people come to me and say, hey, have I ever done anything that was inappropriate, or do you think like was ignorant or racist or prejudiced? And I would say, nothing that I thought of. And they said, if I ever do, would you actually let me know? And I mean, it's just a good posture. And every once in a while you'll run into an Enneagram 8 where I actually had to call someone a couple months ago and actually was like, hey, you know how I told you 3 years ago that I would say something if I ever saw something? Well, I saw something. So but I think it is just a good posture to say, you know what, I would love for you to speak into me, and I promise not to be defensive when you speak. So that'll be the first thing. The second thing is, I think just continue to learn. I think this is what everybody's saying. You know, there's a ton of resources that are out there. I know Esther has a whole list of resources that we should all definitely be watching and listening and reading and stuff like that. And I'm actually going to put in the Facebook chat a website, an organization that I've actually believe in so much, Asian American Christian Collaborative, that I actually believe in so much that I actually started volunteering for them. And so they have a webpage of recommended resources that I think is a very good place to start. For that. And so I would say, ask for feedback, continue learning. And then the last thing that I would say is be a part. I think what we're all wanting to do is build a place where we can have a meeting, or we can have, hang out with friends, and like somebody says something inappropriate to someone, but everybody texts you, right? And they're like, oh, can't believe that what she said, or I can't believe what they said, or this or that. I'd love to develop a community where it is safe for us to not text the other person, but to actually text the person that said it, and to say, hey, I just wanted to say, like, it made me a little bit uncomfortable when you said that. And, maybe you're not aware of like how that could be received, but the way that I took it was this way. And to create a safe community where we're able to be able to have those conversations, to speak directly to those people instead of just texting your friend and being like, you'll never guess, that sort of a thing. So I think we can just commit to building that community, which means stepping into some of the awkward conversations, but doing it in love. As we think about, passages throughout Scripture like 1 Corinthians that talks about the body of Christ, where, we are one and it has many parts. This is the body of Christ that we are to model as the church community. And so, I love the fact that we're able to have this space and create this space, not just for our Asian American brothers and sisters to be able to share, but for others to be able to hear us share. And I think that that's important. And that's not to say that we should only have this conversation moving forward. We should have tons of conversations, and I would love to be a participant and listen to some of those conversations as well. I want to say thank you to everybody who's been tuning in on Facebook, and thank you to those of you who watched us later and left comments, and we promise to go back and read all the comments and all of the things. And actually, we can go back and Facebook comment and actually reply to some of those comments. But I do want to thank all of our wonderful panelists. Just thank you so much for sharing your story, your life, your engagement. Thank you for continuing to engage with this issue and step in deeper. And so with that, we'll see you at the next one, wherever that may be and whatever the topic may be. Thank you guys so much. Keep pursuing this and keep walking with each other.
Have a good night.